Harold sold his empire for love, but fell victim to betrayal, where racism and social injustice became part of a devastating conspiracy. What he learned about the woman changed everything. His money no longer had any power. The following events will shock even the most seasoned readers. But let's start from the beginning. Harold Davis was a man who could not be broken by circumstances or others' ambitions. He was a powerful billionaire whose name was known in every corner of the business world. He was used to having every command obeyed without question, and his decisions often changed people's lives. From the windows of his office atop a skyscraper, he looked out over the entire city, a constant reminder of how high he had climbed. He had everything: multiple luxury homes across different countries, a fleet of private jets, a yacht he jokingly called his toy, and connections in the highest circles, from politicians to celebrities. His life was filled with luxury, power, and influence. But there was one thing beyond his control: love. He met Laura by chance at a charity event. She wasn't from his world, a young, energetic actress just starting her path to fame. Laura wasn't one to chase after wealthy men. She was drawn to creativity, emotions, and art. She didn't know who Harold really was, and that's what captivated him. Her independence, her passion for life and discovery became a revelation for him. For the first time in many years, Harold felt something real, something beyond his usual environment of calculations and deals. He began spending more and more time with Laura, forgetting about meetings and contracts. He gave her the world, and she gave him her heart. But soon, life dealt Harold a blow he couldn't have foreseen. Laura fell ill. At first, it seemed insignificant, just a cold, some fatigue. But over time, her condition worsened. She often fainted, lost consciousness, and doctors couldn't give a clear diagnosis. Her physician shrugged helplessly, saying the illness was progressing too quickly, and standard treatments were powerless. Harold experienced a new kind of fear, the fear of losing the woman who made him feel alive for the first time in years. The medical bills began to skyrocket, but for Harold, money was never an issue. He was ready to spend millions without hesitation to restore Laura's health. But over time, the doctors told him a frightening truth. Traditional treatments wouldn't help, and an experimental therapy was required, one that came with an astronomical price tag. Even for a billionaire, the cost seemed insane. But for Harold, there were no barriers. He was willing to do anything. When the doctor suggested treatment abroad at one of the world's best clinics, he immediately made contact. However, arranging this treatment was incredibly complex and expensive. Not only was money an issue, but political decisions and support from international organizations were needed. Harold realized that time was slipping away, and every moment lost could cost Laura her life. At that moment, he made a decision that shocked those around him. He announced the sale of his company, the empire he had built over decades. This caused an uproar among his partners and shareholders. Business colleagues tried to stop him, insisting it was financial suicide. They offered alternatives, compromises, but Harold was steadfast. His only goal was to save Laura, and no amount of money could compare to her life. He sold everything. The deal was completed swiftly, despite the skepticism and pressure. His entire fortune was directed toward paying for Laura's treatment and the clinic. Laura was transported to Switzerland, where doctors assured him they would do everything possible to save her using the latest methods and technologies. Harold felt relieved. He knew he had done everything he could, and now all he could do was wait. In his heart, he held on to hope that Laura would recover, and they would start a new life, free from fear and illness. He believed his sacrifice had not been in vain. When Laura was placed in the clinic, Harold spent his days in deep thought, waiting endlessly. He felt he had found the true meaning of his life, not in money or success, but in love. Weeks passed since Laura had been transferred to the Swiss clinic for experimental treatment. Although far from her, Harold stayed in constant contact. He called daily, asking about her condition, trying to lift her spirits, assuring her they would get through this difficult period. Laura answered his calls, but Harold began to notice changes in her tone. At first they were subtle, slight pauses between words, as if she was distracted while speaking to him. Later, her responses became more brief, and the calls less frequent. With each passing week, Harold felt a growing coldness in her voice. Once, she had called him first, sharing how her days went, her thoughts, and hopes for the future. Now, Laura answered him formally, without the enthusiasm she once had, as though something important had vanished. Harold tried to reassure himself, attributing it to the effects of treatment and emotional exhaustion from battling illness. But deep inside, anxiety and suspicion grew. One day, when Laura didn't answer his calls for 2 days straight, Harold decided to act. On a whim, he bought a ticket to Switzerland and headed for the clinic where Laura was staying. Upon arrival, he expected to find her weak but happy to see him. But reality was different. When Harold entered her room, he noticed that Laura was absent. Her bed was neatly made, and the room was eerily quiet. He approached the nurse, who awkwardly replied that she couldn't provide information without the clinic administration's approval. Harold, used to getting everything with the snap of his fingers, felt powerless. Each question, every new answer only heightened his anxiety. Where was Laura? Why wouldn't anyone talk about her whereabouts? After several hours, Harold finally managed to meet with the clinic's head physician. The doctor looked nervous and reluctantly explained that Laura had temporarily left the room to take a walk with an old friend. Old friend? Those words struck Harold like a blow, sparking a wave of anger and confusion. Laura had never mentioned any old friends, especially since her entire life before the illness was centered around their relationship. Harold didn't cause a scene at the clinic, but inside, he was boiling. What was going on? Why was Laura acting so distant? He didn't hesitate and hired a private investigator to find out who this friend was and what was happening behind his back. Harold had always known how to act decisively, and now his intuition told him something was terribly wrong. A few days later, the investigator contacted Harold with a report that left him in shock. This old friend was a man named Jack Morton, whose reputation among the wealthy and powerful was far from stellar. Jack was known in certain circles as a skilled manipulator who seduced wealthy women by preying on their emotional vulnerability. He formed relationships with women going through difficult life events, divorces, illnesses, crises. He gained their trust, played on their emotions, and then exploited their money and connections for his own benefit. Harold was devastated. He learned that Laura had been seeing Jack long before her illness symptoms appeared. They often attended social events together in private circles, but Harold had never suspected that Laura might be involved with someone else. Her illness, her suffering, it all now seemed part of some sinister plan. He couldn't believe it, didn't want to. But the facts, presented by the investigator, spoke for themselves. Laura and Jack were connected, and their relationship had started before Harold even met her. Harold spent days pondering what to do next. He felt betrayed and hollow. His love for Laura, his sacrifices to save her, they now seemed like a pathetic game, one in which he had been a pawn. Jack was a predator, and Laura was his instrument. Harold couldn't believe that the woman for whom he had sold his company and lost everything could be involved in such a scheme. Now, he faced a moral dilemma: expose Laura and Jack, or try to salvage what was left of his feelings and their relationship. But one thing was clear. Laura had hidden something much greater from him than just her illness. Harold Davis had always prided himself on his ability to analyze complex situations and make decisions based on facts. But with each new revelation about Laura and Jack, his mind refused to accept that everything between them had been a setup. At first, it seemed impossible. How could the woman he loved have orchestrated such a drama, using his emotions and affection so skillfully? But the truth was more horrifying than any of his suspicions. The private investigator Harold had hired gathered undeniable evidence, laying out a shocking picture. It turned out that Jack Morton wasn't just a casual acquaintance of Laura's. He was her lover, with whom she had maintained a relationship for many years. Their affair had started long before Laura entered Harold's life. Jack was a professional con artist, operating on the fringes of the law, creating the illusion of legitimate business dealings while actually engaging in extortion and manipulation. His targets were always wealthy, lonely, emotionally vulnerable women who sought support during difficult times in their lives. It was Jack who pushed Laura to participate in their joint scheme. When she started dating Harold, Jack immediately saw the unique opportunity before them. Harold, with his influence and immense wealth, was the perfect victim. Jack convinced Laura to fake her illness in order to manipulate the billionaire's emotions. Together, they orchestrated an entire drama, from fake diagnoses, supported by forged medical reports, to dramatic conversations about how Harold needed to save her, no matter the cost. Following Jack's plan, Laura began to slowly distance herself from Harold, all while maintaining the illusion of weakness and sickness. Every move, every emotion was calculated by Jack, who controlled her actions and helped her remain convincing in Harold's eyes. Jack stayed in the shadows, pulling the strings while Harold desperately tried to preserve their relationship and save her life. But in reality, Laura had never been sick. All her symptoms were staged, and the test results falsified. Harold was shattered. He couldn't believe that anyone could be so cruel as to exploit his trust and love this way. His entire world collapsed in a single moment. At first he felt only shock, as if it were some terrible nightmare from which he would soon wake. But then came the realization that it was all real. Laura, the woman for whom he had been ready to sacrifice everything, was nothing more than a puppet in the hands of a con artist. Everything she had said, all their talks about the future, about living together after her recovery, it was all a lie. Harold spent hours trying to understand why Laura had agreed to this. Her eyes, her smile, her laughter, it had all seemed real, sincere. How could someone stage such a drama day after day while continuing to look him in the eye and talk about love? But the answer, oddly enough, was simple. Greed. Laura wasn't Jack's first victim, and her desire for wealth and an easy life had blinded her to everything else. Jack had promised her that if they could drain Harold of all his money, they would escape together abroad and start a new life filled with luxury and pleasure. Harold felt as if his world had turned hollow. His company, which he had built over decades, was gone. The fortune that had been his pillar of success had vanished in an attempt to save a woman who, in the end, had turned out to be a fraud. He had lost not only his money, but what had seemed to be the meaning of his life. In the days following the revelation, Harold felt broken. His heart burned with pain, and his mind refused to accept the entire truth. He wanted revenge, not just on Laura, but on Jack, who had destroyed his life. But deep down, there was no longer the energy he once had to fight business battles and win complex deals. Faced with betrayal, Harold realized that his strength was gone. He searched within himself for answers to the questions tormenting his mind. How had he been so blind? Why hadn't he seen that he was being used? But the truth was obvious. He had been blinded by love and his confidence that he could buy anything, even happiness. Now, sitting in an empty house, where every room reminded him of Laura, Harold realized that money had not protected him from the most important blow. Greed and the desire for an easy life at his expense had led to the collapse of his world. After Harold learned the whole truth, his first instinct was to burn everything around him. His memories, feelings, trust, all of it seemed crushed under the weight of betrayal. He spent several days in absolute emptiness, sitting in his vacant home, contemplating what to do next. One half of his soul screamed for revenge, that Laura and Jack should pay for what they had done to his life. The other half tried to find a way to salvage at least something from what he had lost. Harold knew that one wrong move, one impulsive act of anger, could destroy him entirely. He was too seasoned a player in the world of big money and intrigue to let emotions control him. So instead of acting on impulse, he decided to rely on his connections. Over the years in business, Harold had built up many useful contacts in various circles, from influential politicians to private investigators and intelligence operatives. Now it was time to use those resources. Reaching out to people who owed their career success and significant wealth to him, Harold began gathering information. Investigators quickly tracked down Laura and Jack's whereabouts. They were hiding in a small resort town on the coast. They had a lavish villa, bought with the money Harold had received from selling his company. The life they had dreamed of had become a reality, while Harold was left to grapple with the pain of betrayal. He decided to act quickly, giving them no time to prepare or escape. Without warning them of his arrival, Harold traveled to the town, filled with a determination to restore justice. When he arrived at the villa, surrounded by blooming gardens and drenched in luxury, his heart sank. Everything he saw was the result of his hard work and his trust. The money meant to save the woman he loved now funded the lives of his betrayers. But this time, Harold didn't come with emotions. He came with cold calculation. When he approached the house and knocked on the door, Laura answered. Her face froze in shock for a moment when she saw him. Clearly, she hadn't expected his appearance. Harold stood silently, saying nothing. There was no love or pain left in his gaze, just cold indifference. Laura began to speak, trying to explain herself, to justify her situation. She spoke of how she was forced into it, how everything had spiraled out of control. But every word, every gesture seemed meaningless. For Harold, her words no longer mattered. She was no longer the Laura he had once loved. Her face, her voice, everything felt alien and distant. Once, her eyes had sparkled with life, passion, sincerity, but now they were empty. He noticed how she had lost her confidence, how her gaze dropped when she realized she could no longer deceive him. Harold walked into the house without a word, and behind him, Jack appeared. Jack initially tried to flash his usual charm, stepping toward Harold, but quickly realized the situation was beyond his control. Harold invited them to sit at the table, and without unnecessary words, he laid out the documents his lawyers had prepared. These were papers that annulled all the financial transactions and reclaimed the money that had been transferred to Laura. Jack, sensing the threat, began to protest, trying to frame it as a misunderstanding or a dispute. But Harold was unyielding. He was no longer the man who allowed his emotions to be manipulated. Jack quickly understood that Harold hadn't come for negotiations, but to take back what was rightfully his. And if Jack didn't comply, the consequences would be devastating. Jack knew that Harold, with his connections and resources, could easily ruin him, both financially and personally. Jack wasn't prepared for such a confrontation and was terrified. His bravado and false courage evaporated instantly. With his tail between his legs, Jack signed all the documents, acknowledging his defeat. Laura sat silently next to him, watching the events unfold. She no longer tried to defend herself, not saying a word. Harold could see that for her, it was all over before he even arrived. She had lost everything: the money, the love, and even her pride. Harold didn't reproach her, didn't gloat over his victory. He knew this wasn't really a victory. No amount of money, no documents could restore what he had truly lost: trust, faith in people, and love. When all the formalities were done, Harold stood up and left without saying goodbye. As he stepped outside, he felt only a faint sense of relief. This wasn't a triumph, but more like the closing of a long and painful chapter that had taken more from him than it had given. When Harold returned home after severing the knot of betrayal, he felt not triumph, but something entirely different: emptiness. Surrounded once again by his billions, with his company and assets restored, he suddenly realized that money no longer brought him joy. The very things he had worked for, planned for, and risked everything for now felt hollow and meaningless. In his hands were the keys to vast power, but his soul, once driven by ambition, grew colder with each passing day. He sat once more in his office atop the skyscraper, as he had done hundreds of times before. Through the panoramic windows, the familiar view of the city unfolded, a sight that used to fill him with pride. The city lived and breathed with millions of stories, but for Harold, the noise was just an empty backdrop. He watched the flow of people and cars below, but his mind was elsewhere. For the first time in many years, he felt that his life had lost its direction. As he looked at his achievements, deals, companies, contracts, it only made him feel worse. Within these walls had once resided his dreams, his ambitions, his passion for success. But now all of that felt foreign. He had achieved everything he had ever wanted, yet he was left alone, without purpose, without meaning. Money and power were no longer his ultimate goal, and he had never pursued anything greater. Laura, the woman for whom he had sacrificed almost everything, no longer existed for him as a person. She had become a symbol of his mistake, his delusion. Harold was beginning to realize that his desire to save her had been less an act of true love and more an attempt to fill a deep inner void. Laura had become a projection of his longing for something he had never had, a real connection with another person. But instead of giving him meaning, she had only shattered his last illusions. His life had always been built on external success, on victories, recognition, admiration from colleagues and competitors. He was used to being a leader, used to his word being law. But beneath that facade was the loneliness he had been running from, constantly setting new goals and new peaks to climb. Laura had been his last great escape. He had tried to save her to prove to himself that he was capable of something more than just making money. He wanted to be her hero, her protector, but in the end, he became the victim. The emptiness he felt grew with each passing day. Inside, there was no longer the energy that had once driven him to new achievements. His whole life suddenly seemed like a meaningless race with no true goal. Once, he had believed that success and wealth were all that was needed for happiness. But now, sitting in this deserted office, he realized he had been wrong. He had gained wealth, but lost his soul. Harold remembered how, in his youth, he had dreamed of a simple life, of living by his own rules, not chasing material goals. Back then, his dreams were pure and full of meaning. But as he climbed the career ladder, those dreams faded, replaced by endless greed and a thirst for recognition. He had become the very person he had despised in his youth, a man for whom money meant everything. And only now, years later, did he understand how much he had lost along the way. Looking back on his life, Harold suddenly realized that he had never truly lived for himself. Every decision, every action, had been aimed at maintaining his reputation, his position in the business world. But this wasn't his life. It was a game in which he had become a prisoner of his own ambitions. He had tried to fill the void with success, but only widened the emptiness. Now, with Laura exposed and Jack having signed all the necessary documents, Harold had his money back. But along with that money came the full weight of his old life. He felt as though he was once again trapped in a cage. Only this time, the bars weren't obligations to shareholders, but his own consciousness. Laura was no longer his love. She had become his sentence. She had revealed to him a truth he had long refused to see. Harold realized that he couldn't return to his old life. The world he had built on money and power no longer held any meaning for him. He had achieved everything he wanted, but in the process, he had lost himself. Now, he faced a choice. Either continue living as he had before, hiding his pain behind the facade of success, or break free from this vicious cycle and find a new purpose. But he didn't yet know what to do next.